The last echo of artillery fire had faded from the horizon 3 months earlier, but Samuel Morris still jolted awake at the slightest sound that resembled the metallic clank of tank treads on pavement. In the pre-dawn darkness of his modest apartment in Detroit, his fingers instinctively reached for the small bent nail he kept on his nightstand, a seemingly worthless piece of metal that had once been the centerpiece of his greatest contribution to the war effort. The nail caught the first gray light of dawn as Sam turned it between calloused fingers, a ritual he performed each morning as a reminder of all that had happened and all that remained unacknowledged. Outside, the factories of Detroit were roaring back to life, retooled from the machinery of war to the vehicles of peace, but Sam found himself caught between worlds, trapped in the strange limbo that separated the urgent clarity of wartime from the uncertain ambiguities of peace. The transition had been more difficult than he had anticipated. During the war, every engineering decision carried the weight of life and death. Every production milestone represented tangible progress toward victory. The shared purpose that had united Americans across divisions of class and background had dissolved almost overnight, replaced by a scramble for individual advancement in the new consumer economy. Veterans like his brother returned to a country simultaneously grateful for their sacrifice and eager to move past the uncomfortable realities they carried home with them. The bent nail in Sam's hand was a physical anchor to that rapidly receding world, a world of terrible urgency and moral clarity that, for all its horrors, had given him a sense of purpose he now struggled to recapture. His apartment was sparse, functional with few personal touches, a bachelor's temporary accommodation that had somehow become semi-permanent during the all-consuming years of war production. A framed photograph of his family stood on the dresser, his parents in their Sunday best, his younger brother in his army uniform before shipping out, and Sam himself looking uncomfortable in a suit that marked him as the white-collar member of a blue-collar family. The Morris men had worked with their hands for generations, on farms, in factories, building the physical infrastructure of America. Sam had been the first to attend college, studying engineering at Michigan State before the war created unprecedented demand for technical expertise in Detroit's converted auto plants. That divergent path had created a subtle distance between Sam and his father and brother, a distance he had felt acutely whenever he visited home wearing pressed slacks while they arrived from shifts in work clothes embedded with machine oil and metal filings. They had been proud of his education, his office job, his clean hands, but there remained an unspoken sense that his work was somehow less substantial than theirs, his contribution to the family legacy less tangible. The bent nail had bridged that gap in ways Sam could never articulate to them. It represented his reconnection to the practical, hands-on problem-solving that had characterized Morris men for generations, even as he applied his formal engineering knowledge to systematize and scale the solution. In 1943, Sam had been a 32-year-old mechanical engineer at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, the largest tank producer in America, where thousands of Sherman tanks rolled off the assembly line bound for battlefields across Europe. The arsenal itself was a marvel of American industrial might, a massive complex in Warren, Michigan, purpose-built in 1940 before America had even entered the war. Under Chrysler's management, it had grown into a behemoth that employed over 5,000 workers across all shifts, producing more than 25% of all tanks made for the Allied war effort. The speed of its construction and conversion to full production had become legendary, from groundbreaking to the first tank rolling off the line in just 6 months, testament to American industrial capability when unleashed toward a single purpose. The Sherman, officially designated as the M4 medium tank, was America's primary battle tank, a reliable workhorse that could be mass-produced in numbers that overwhelmed the enemy. Standing over 9 feet tall and weighing more than 30 tons, each Sherman required approximately 1,600 man-hours to complete, with production costs running to about $45,000 per unit. Astronomical figures at the time, but considered necessary for the war effort. American strategy emphasized standardization and quantity over technical superiority, an approach summarized by one general's remark that he would rather have 100 decent tanks today than 20 perfect ones next year. This philosophy had transformed Detroit, the arsenal of democracy, into the greatest tank-producing center the world had ever seen. But early reports from the front revealed a deadly flaw. German anti-tank weapons could penetrate the Sherman's armor with terrifying ease, earning it the grim nickname Ronson among Allied troops after the popular cigarette lighter advertised with the slogan, "Lights first time every time." When a Sherman was hit, it typically burst into flames, giving its crew mere seconds to escape before being consumed by fire. The M4's gasoline engine, positioned in the rear, was particularly vulnerable, and its ammunition storage configuration meant that a single penetrating hit could ignite a catastrophic chain reaction. German tank crews called the Sherman the Tommy Cooker, while American tankers grimly joked about riding into battle in a death trap. These nicknames reflected the harsh reality that a Sherman hit by German armor-piercing rounds had a crew survival rate far lower than comparable German tanks. The statistics haunted Sam. While American production outpaced German tank losses at a rate of almost 4-to-1, the human cost was measured in the thousands of young men burned alive inside their vehicles or wounded so severely that death might have seemed merciful. A penetrating hit from a German 80mm gun or a Panther tank's 75mm weapon gave a Sherman crew between 10 and 15 seconds to escape before the tank became an inferno, a nearly impossible time frame for men to react, unbuckle, open hatches, and clear the vehicle, especially if wounded or disoriented by the initial impact. Sam's desk in the engineering department had become a graveyard of field reports describing tanks destroyed and crews killed or horrifically burned. Each morning, he would arrive to find new accounts stacked neatly by the night secretary, their clinical descriptions failing to mask the human tragedy they represented. What troubled Sam most was how these reports were processed, acknowledged, filed, and seemingly forgotten by the higher-ups, who remained focused on production quotas rather than design improvements. The official response was always the same. Any significant redesign would slow production, and American strategy relied on overwhelming the enemy with numbers rather than technical superiority. On a cold November morning in 1943, Sam arrived at work to find a different kind of report on his desk. It wasn't an official military document, but a letter, smudged and water-stained, from a tank commander named Lieutenant Michael Collins, who had served with Sam's younger brother in North Africa. The letter described how Sam's brother's tank had taken a direct hit from a German 80mm gun. Miraculously, the entire crew had escaped before the ammunition inside ignited. Lieutenant Collins wrote that the tank's unusual modification, a series of strategically placed bent nails that created air gaps in certain sections of the armor, had delayed the spread of fire just long enough for the crew to escape. The modification had been dismissed as a field superstition by most, but Collins swore by its effectiveness and credited Sam's brother with saving his life and the lives of countless other tankers who had adopted the technique. Sam had never heard of this modification, and his brother had never mentioned it in his infrequent letters home. The revelation struck him like a physical blow. While he had been shuffling papers in Detroit, his younger brother had been developing practical solutions that saved lives on the battlefield. The contrast between his bureaucratic complicity and his brother's pragmatic heroism filled Sam with a shame that hardened into resolve. That afternoon, instead of filing Lieutenant Collins's letter as procedure dictated, Sam slipped it into his jacket pocket and began his own investigation into the bent nail trick. The arsenal's vast manufacturing floor stretched before Sam like an industrial cathedral, the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal forming a cacophonous hymn to American productivity. Welders in protective masks moved between half-assembled tank hulls, their torches casting long shadows and sending cascades of sparks across the concrete floor. Sam had spent most of his war in this environment, but had rarely ventured onto the floor itself, preferring the ordered quiet of the engineering offices. Now he moved cautiously between stations, watching as each Sherman gradually took shape, from skeletal frame to armored beast ready for combat. Near the end of the assembly line, Sam noticed a small group of workers gathered around a tank, speaking in hushed tones. As he approached, they fell silent, regarding him with the wary expressions of men accustomed to supervision rather than collaboration. Sam recognized their unofficial leader, an older man named Frank Wojcik, whose reputation as a master welder was matched only by his stubborn resistance to management directives. Frank's face was a map of deep lines carved by decades of squinting against welding glare, his massive forearms covered in the small circular scars of metal splatter that marked veterans of his trade. Frank had come to America in 1921, one of thousands of Poles who had fled the devastation of the Great War and the subsequent Polish-Soviet conflict. He had arrived at Ellis Island with nothing but his skill as a metalworker and a determination to build a new life in the industrial heartland. Detroit had welcomed him, as it had welcomed waves of immigrants before him, Italians, Germans, Irish, Greeks, all drawn by the promise of steady work in the booming auto industry. By the time war production began, Frank had established himself as one of the finest welders in the city, a man whose hands could coax metal into impossible configurations and whose welds never failed under pressure. The war had transformed Frank's status in ways that reflected America's complicated relationship with its immigrant communities. Suddenly, his Polish background made him a valuable interpreter for the influx of less experienced Eastern European workers recruited to meet wartime production demands. His accent, once a liability that had confined him to the factory floor despite his exceptional skill, became an asset as management sought to communicate complex technical requirements to a diverse workforce. Yet he remained an outsider in many ways, viewed with lingering suspicion by some who questioned the loyalties of foreign-born workers, even as they built the weapons that would liberate their homelands from Nazi occupation. "Mr. Morris," Frank acknowledged with a curt nod, his Polish accent still thick despite 20 years in America. "You're a long way from your desk." The distance between them was more than physical. Engineers like Sam occupied a space between management and labor, educated enough to command respect from above, but often viewed with skepticism from below, particularly by veteran tradesmen who had learned their skills through apprenticeship rather than formal education. In the rigid hierarchy of the arsenal, engineers rarely ventured onto the production floor, except to issue corrections or inspect completed work, creating an atmosphere where collaboration between design and implementation remained the exception rather than the rule. "I'm looking into something," Sam replied, pulling the letter from his pocket. "Something about a modification some tankers are making in the field with bent nails." He watched their expressions carefully and saw the flicker of recognition in Frank's eyes before the welder's face returned to its customary impassivity. "My brother was using it. I'd like to understand how it works." For a long moment, Frank said nothing, his weathered eyes measuring Sam with the precision he usually reserved for weld joints. Then he nodded almost imperceptibly to his companions, who drifted away to resume their tasks, leaving the two men alone beside the partially assembled tank. "It's not in any blueprint," Frank said quietly, running a calloused hand along the tank's armor plating. "Not something the engineers upstairs would approve." He glanced at Sam. "No offense." "None taken," Sam assured him. "I just want to know if it works." Frank's expression softened slightly. "Your brother? He's over there?" Sam nodded. "North Africa. Now Italy, I think." "My nephew is with the 1st Armored," Frank said, his voice dropping further. "Tank gunner. He writes when he can. Says the German 88s are cutting through our tanks like they're made of tin." He tapped the armor plating. "This isn't enough, not against those guns." The admission created a moment of shared understanding between the two men, an acknowledgement that despite the arsenal's impressive production figures and rigorous quality control, the product they were sending into battle had a fatal flaw that no one in authority seemed willing to address. In this recognition, the boundary between engineer and welder temporarily dissolved, replaced by a common concern for the young men whose lives depended on their work. "The nail trick," Frank began, lowering his voice further. "It started with the British. Their Shermans were getting knocked out just like ours, but one of their mechanics noticed something. When a shell hits, it doesn't just punch through. It creates a shockwave, compresses the air inside. That compressed air is what ignites the fuel ammunition." He tapped the tank's side. "The nail trick creates small air gaps in strategic places. Not enough to weaken the armor, but enough to interrupt the shockwave pattern, and that prevents the tank from catching fire," Sam asked skeptically. "Not prevents," Frank corrected. "Delays. Gives the crew maybe 20-30 seconds more to get out before everything goes up. Doesn't sound like much sitting here in Detroit, but over there," he gestured vaguely toward the eastern horizon, toward Europe. 30 seconds is the difference between making it home or not. Sam studied the tank's surface, trying to envision how such a simple modification might work. "Show me," he said finally. Frank hesitated, glancing around the vast floor. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a handful of 3-inch nails, slightly bent in the middle. "We don't have much time," he said. "Follow me." The two men moved to the underside of the tank, where Frank pointed out specific junction points where the floor plate met the side armor. "Here," he said, positioning a bent nail so that it created a small gap at the seam before welding it in place. "And here," he continued, moving to another junction. "The pattern matters. Too many weakens the structure. Too few doesn't disrupt the shockwave enough." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, the result of countless repetitions performed in stolen moments away from supervisory eyes. "How many tanks have you modified this way?" Sam asked, watching in fascination. Frank shrugged. Hundreds, maybe. Not just me, all of us who know the trick, we don't talk about it. The management would shut it down, say it compromises the design integrity. Does it? In testing? Maybe it shows up as a tiny weakness in the armor. In real combat? It gives boys like your brother a fighting chance when they take a hit. Frank's eyes locked with Sam's. Which matters more? The question hung between them, surrounded by the cacophony of the factory floor, yet somehow existing in a pocket of profound silence. In that moment, Sam felt the weight of every report he'd filed away, every modification request he'd denied on grounds of production efficiency, every decision made in the abstract that had concrete consequences for men like his brother. "Teach me," Sam said finally. "Teach me everything about this trick." Over the following weeks, Sam divided his time between his official duties in the engineering office and clandestine hours on the factory floor, learning the intricacies of the bent nail modification from Frank and his crew. The trick, he discovered, was elegant in its simplicity yet complex in its application. The pattern of nails had to be precise. Too many would indeed compromise the tank's structural integrity. Too few would fail to disrupt the shockwave patterns that led to catastrophic fires. The modification added mere ounces to the tank's weight and was virtually undetectable to casual inspection. Sam's engineering background allowed him to understand the physics behind the modification in ways that even Frank, with all his practical expertise, did not. He began documenting the pattern, calculating optimal placement points, and even developing a simple template that could be used to standardize the modification across tanks. Yet as his understanding deepened, so too did his awareness of the institutional barriers preventing official adoption of the technique. Any formal proposal would trigger months of testing and committee reviews, while tanks continued to roll off the line without the life-saving modification. The moral calculus became clear to Sam. Official channels meant delay, and delay meant death for tank crews who might have been saved. The system that employed him, that he had faithfully served, was too rigid, too slow, and too removed from the urgent realities of combat to respond adequately to the needs of the men whose lives depended on its products. In this gap between institutional procedure and battlefield necessity, Sam found his purpose, not as an engineer who designed tanks according to specifications, but as a secret ally to the men who fought in them. On a bitter December evening, as snow fell silently outside the arsenal's high windows, Sam approached Frank with a proposal. "We need to scale this up," he said, spreading his template across a workbench. "Not just the tanks assembled here, but at all the plants. And we need to get information to the field so crews can modify the tanks they already have." Frank studied the template, his expression guarded. "The management will never know," Sam interrupted. "Not officially. I can create a technical bulletin that looks legitimate enough to circulate without raising flags. We can call it a field maintenance recommendation or something similarly innocuous." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "You'd risk your job?" Sam thought of his brother, of Lieutenant Collins, of all the unnamed men who climbed into Shermans knowing their odds of survival if hit. "It's not much of a risk compared to what they face every day," he replied quietly. Frank nodded slowly. "Then we'll need help, not just here but at every plant. You know people? Welders? Assemblymen you trust? At Ford, Chrysler, American Locomotive?" "Yes. Men who understand what's at stake." Frank studied Sam with new respect. "They'll listen to an engineer backing this up. Gives it legitimacy." Thus began what would later be called, by the few who knew of its existence, the Nail Network, clandestine operations spanning multiple manufacturing plants and extending all the way to the European theater of operations. Sam created technical bulletins with detailed instructions for implementing the bent nail modification, carefully worded to sound official without actually claiming official authorization. Frank's connections among the working men of America's tank arsenals ensured these bulletins reached the right hands, and soon, thousands of Shermans were receiving the life-saving modification before shipping overseas. More challenging was getting information to tanks already in the field, but here, Sam's position in the engineering department proved invaluable. He carefully inserted his instructions into legitimate maintenance update packages sent to combat units, ensuring they would reach tank maintenance crews across Europe. The modification spread like a beneficial contagion among Allied armored units, passed from crew to crew, from veteran to replacement, a folk remedy that carried the weight of battlefield experience. For over a year, the Nail Network operated in the shadows of America's vast war industry, its impact measured not in production statistics, but in the lives of men who emerged from burning tanks with just enough time to escape. Sam never received official acknowledgement of his role, never saw his name on commendations or reports. His contribution to the war effort existed in a parallel reality to the one recorded in official histories. Invisible, yet profound. Unauthorized, yet essential. In March 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and victory seemed increasingly certain, Sam received a letter from his brother. "The strangest thing happened last week," he wrote. "An officer from some technical evaluation unit was inspecting our tank after we took a hit, but managed to get clear before she burned. He was mighty interested in those nails we've been using since North Africa. Seemed surprised when every tanker in the company swore by them. Said something about unofficial modifications and proper channels, but our captain told him those nails had saved more men than all the official improvements combined. Don't know if anything will come of it, but thought you might find it interesting given your position." Sam folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket, a thin smile playing across his lips as he imagined the consternation of some rear echelon evaluation officer confronted with a modification that existed in no official blueprint, yet had become standard practice across the theater. The war was winding down, the urgent need for tanks diminishing as Germany crumbled under the Allied advance. Soon the arsenals would retool for peacetime production, and the bent nail trick would fade into obscurity, remembered only by the men whose lives it had saved, and the few who had implemented it against institutional inertia. Now, in the strange half-light of post-war America, Sam found himself adrift. The arsenal had reduced its workforce by 70%, transitioning back to civilian vehicle production. Frank and most of his crew had been let go in the first wave of layoffs, their specialized welding skills suddenly surplus to requirement. Sam had retained his position in the engineering department, now focused on automobile design, but found the work hollow compared to the urgent purpose that had driven him during the war. On this particular morning in August 1945, as Sam prepared for another day at the drawing board, a knock at his apartment door disrupted his ritual contemplation of the bent nail. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with a lean, weathered man in civilian clothes who nonetheless carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. It took Sam several moments to recognize Lieutenant Collins, the man whose letter had set everything in motion nearly 2 years earlier. "Mr. Morris," Collins said, extending his hand. "Michael Collins. I hope you don't mind the early hour and unexpected visit. Your brother gave me your address when we shipped home." Sam shook the man's hand, noting the firmness of his grip despite the network of burn scars that covered his right forearm and disappeared beneath his sleeve. "Of course, Lieutenant. Please come in." "Just Michael now," Collins corrected with a small smile. "Been a civilian for 3 whole weeks." He entered the apartment and glanced around the sparse living space, his eyes coming to rest on the bent nail lying on the nightstand. "I see you kept one," he observed quietly. Sam followed his gaze. "A reminder," he said simply. Collins nodded in understanding. "That's why I'm here, actually, about the nails." He reached into his jacket and produced a small, leather-bound notebook. "I've been collecting names. Every man I could find who believes they made it out of a hit because of those extra seconds the modification bought them." He handed the notebook to Sam. "Thought you might want to see it." Sam accepted the notebook with reverence, turning its pages slowly. Each entry contained a name, a unit designation, a date, and a brief description of the tank hit. Some entries included additional details. Entire crew survived. 3 out of 5 made it. Got out just before the ammo cooked off. Page after page of testimonials, hundreds of them, representing men who had emerged from the war alive against the odds. Men who had returned to wives, children, parents. Men who would have children and grandchildren who might otherwise never have existed. "How did you know?" Sam asked finally, looking up from the notebook. "About my involvement?" Collins smiled. "Your brother mentioned you worked in tank engineering. Then, toward the end of the war, there was an investigation into unauthorized modifications being made to Shermans. Some officers from technical services were asking questions, confiscating maintenance bulletins that had circulated through the units. Bulletins that looked official but couldn't be traced back to any authorized source." He shrugged. "Wasn't hard to connect the dots for those of us paying attention." "There were consequences?" Sam asked, a flutter of anxiety rising in his chest even now, months after the war's end. Collins shook his head. "The war ended before they got very far. And truthfully, I don't think they had the stomach to pursue it, even if they'd had time. Too many lives obviously saved, too many crews ready to testify to its effectiveness." He gestured to the notebook. "That's just the men I could track down personally. There are hundreds more, maybe thousands." Sam closed the notebook gently, running his fingers over its worn cover. "It wasn't just me," he said. "There were dozens involved. Frank Wojcik at the arsenal here, men at other plants, maintenance crews in the field who passed it on." "I know," Collins acknowledged. "I've met some of them, but from what I gather, you were the one who systematized it, who spread it beyond local implementation." He studied Sam thoughtfully. "You know there will never be any official recognition. The Army can hardly acknowledge that an unauthorized modification saved lives when their official design was getting men killed." "I didn't do it for recognition," Sam replied, though he felt a pang at the knowledge that the nail network would never appear in any history of the war, that its impact would be measured only in the private gratitude of men who might not even know to whom they owed their lives. "No," Collins agreed. "You did it because it was right, because you saw a gap between what the system provided and what was needed, and you filled it regardless of personal risk or institutional approval." He reached out and picked up the bent nail from the nightstand, turning it in his fingers, much as Sam had done earlier. "But recognition isn't the same as remembrance. Those of us who know, who benefited, we remember. We carry that debt." As Collins spoke, Sam felt something uncoil within him, a tension he had carried since the war's end, a sense of incompletion or unacknowledged purpose that had left him adrift in peacetime. In this man's quiet understanding, in the tangible evidence of lives saved recorded in the notebook, Sam found a kind of closure that no official commendation could have provided. His work had mattered in the most fundamental way, not in the abstract metrics of production quotas or engineering specifications, but in the continued existence of men who otherwise would have perished. "What will you do now?" Sam asked after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. Collins placed the nail back on the nightstand with deliberate care. "Build something," he said simply. "A business, family, a community. That's the real obligation of those of us who came back when so many didn't. To build something worthy of their sacrifice." He fixed Sam with a direct gaze. "And you?" Sam had been asking himself the same question for months, without arriving at a satisfactory answer. His engineering position was secure but unfulfilling, focused on cosmetic improvements to civilian vehicles rather than life-saving innovations. The urgent moral clarity of wartime had given way to the mundane compromises of consumer capitalism, where design decisions were driven by marketing considerations rather than human necessity. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everything seems less consequential now." Collins nodded in understanding. "It's hard to go from saving lives to designing tail fins," he observed wryly. "But there are still gaps to be filled, still places where systems fail to meet human needs." He gestured around them, encompassing the rapidly changing post-war world beyond the apartment walls. "The war concentrated everything, clarified it. Peace diffuses, complicates, but the same principles apply. See the need that others miss. Find the simple solution that institutions overlook. Work through the networks that exist beneath official channels." As Collins spoke, something stirred in Sam's memory. A report he'd seen recently about traffic fatalities rising as more cars returned to American roads. The auto industry's focus on style and speed rather than safety, the absence of basic protection for passengers in collisions. Another gap between institutional priorities and human needs, another opportunity to apply engineering knowledge to saving lives outside official channels. "Maybe you're right," Sam said slowly, a new sense of possibility emerging from the fog of post-war aimlessness. "Maybe there are still tricks to be developed, still networks to be built." Collins smiled, recognizing the shift in Sam's demeanor. "That's the other obligation of survival," he said quietly. "To carry forward what we learned at such cost. Not just to build, but to build better, more humanely, more responsibly." He stood and extended his hand again. "I should let you get on with your day, but I'm glad I found you, Mr. Morris. Glad I could deliver that." He nodded toward the notebook. Sam rose and shook Collins's hand, feeling the texture of burn scars against his palm. "Thank you," he said with genuine emotion, "for this and for the letter you sent during the war. It changed everything for me." After Collins departed, Sam remained standing in his apartment, the notebook in one hand and the bent nail in the other, symbols of a hidden history that would never appear in official accounts, but lived on in the continued existence of men who had escaped burning tanks with seconds to spare. The nail represented both a physical solution to a design flaw and a moral response to an institutional failure, the embodiment of what could be accomplished when human need took precedence over procedural correctness. The true innovation of the bent nail trick lay not in its engineering elegance, but in the invisible network that had distributed it, a parallel system operating in the shadows of the official hierarchy, connecting factory floors to battlefields through channels that no organizational chart could capture. This network had transcended the traditional boundaries between engineers and tradesmen, between officers and enlisted men, between those who designed systems and those who lived within their constraints. It was a reminder that the most vital connections in any human enterprise often remain unnamed and unacknowledged, existing in the informal relationships and tacit knowledge shared by people united in purpose, if not in position. What troubled Sam was how easily such networks dissolved once their immediate purpose had been served, how the war's end had severed connections between people who might never have interacted in peacetime. Frank Wojcik had returned to Poland to search for surviving family members. The tank crews had dispersed to hometowns across America. The shared urgency that had united them had evaporated with the surrender documents, leaving behind isolated individuals struggling to apply wartime lessons to peacetime problems without the support of collective action. The post-war world seemed determined to forget such lessons, rushing headlong into a consumer society predicated on planned obsolescence rather than durable solutions, on individual convenience rather than collective welfare. The newspapers spoke of an American century of unprecedented prosperity, of technological marvels that would transform daily life, atomic energy, television, jet travel, while remaining silent about the human costs of progress and the moral compromises required to maintain the illusion of perfect systems. Yet the bent nail trick had demonstrated that even the most carefully engineered systems contain gaps, spaces where official solutions fail to address human realities, where institutional knowledge proves insufficient against practical challenges. These gaps could be viewed as design flaws or as opportunities for intervention, depending on one's perspective and position. For Sam, they had become windows into a different way of understanding his responsibility as an engineer, not merely to design systems according to specifications, but to recognize and respond to the human needs that specifications often obscured. Sam placed the nail carefully in his pocket, where it would remain for years to come, a talisman and a reminder. Then he tucked the notebook securely under his arm and left for work, his mind already turning over new problems, new gaps to be filled, new networks to be built in a world that was rapidly forgetting the hard lessons of war, even as it rushed headlong into the promising but perilous future of peace. As he walked through the awakening streets of Detroit, Sam felt the weight of the notebook against his side, not a burden, but a foundation upon which to build whatever came next. The bent nail trick had been a response to a specific crisis, but its underlying principle transcended the circumstances of its creation. The recognition that systems, however well-intended, often fail to account for the full complexity of human experience, and that those who see these gaps have a responsibility to fill them, with or without institutional blessing. In the years that followed, this principle would guide Sam through a career that rarely brought public recognition, but repeatedly placed him at the intersection of technical problems and human needs. He would become what some called a corporate troubleshooter, but what he privately thought of as a gap filler, an engineer who specialized in identifying the places where official solutions fell short and developing unofficial modifications to address unacknowledged needs. His contribution to automotive safety systems in the 1950s, though largely uncredited in patent applications and corporate histories, would save countless lives on America's expanding highway system. His quiet insistence on environmental considerations in industrial processes, long before the environmental movement gained mainstream traction, would prevent pollutants from entering waterways and lungs. His mentorship of younger engineers, particularly those from backgrounds underrepresented in the profession, would create a new generation of gap fillers who carried forward his approach to socially responsible engineering. Through it all, Sam would carry the bent nail as a physical reminder of his most important lesson, that the measure of innovation lies not in its technical sophistication or official recognition, but in its human impact, often invisible except to those whose lives it touches directly. The nail reminded him that the most essential work frequently occurs in the margins of official systems, in the spaces between institutional boundaries, in the gap between what is authorized and what is needed. It reminded him that such work rarely receives public acknowledgement, but creates ripple effects that extend far beyond its immediate application. Effects measured not in patents or promotions, but in lives continued, in possibilities preserved, in human potential protected from premature extinction. The morning sun broke fully over the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets, but illuminating the path ahead. For the first time since the war's end, Samuel Morris walked with purpose, carrying with him the names of men who lived because of bent nails and the determination to find the equivalent simple solutions to the complex problems of peace. The story of the bent nail trick would never appear in history books, would never be taught in engineering schools, would fade from collective memory as the war receded into the past. But its legacy would continue in the lives saved and in the example it provided to those who understood that sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that remain invisible except in their effects. Like bent nails, hidden within the armor of tanks, unremarkable in appearance but profound in consequence. In the emerging landscape of post-war America, there would be no shortage of systems in need of such invisible corrections, no shortage of institutions blind to their own failings, no shortage of opportunities for those willing to operate in the liminal spaces between official channels and human necessities. The war had ended, but the work of building a world worthy of survival continued, not in grand gestures or revolutionary redesigns, but in the accumulated impact of countless bent nail tricks applied where they were needed most, one life-saving innovation at a time. And perhaps this is the most enduring truth about human progress, that its course is determined not only by the celebrated breakthroughs that make headlines and transform industries, but also by the countless small corrections made by individuals who notice what others overlook, who find elegance in simplicity, who value human life above institutional protocol. These corrections rarely receive acknowledgement in their time, their creators seldom recognized for their contributions. Like bent nails welded into tank armor, they do their work invisibly, known only by the absence of tragedy, by the presence of those who might otherwise have been lost. Yet in their accumulation, these small innovations, these acts of practical compassion and moral courage, shape the world as profoundly as any revolutionary technology or grand political movement. They are the hidden joints that hold together the visible structure of history, the unseen supports that allow us to build toward a more humane future, one bent nail at a time.